Welcome to the Authority File. I'm Bill Mickey, your host and the editorial director at Choice. For the last several episodes, I've been speaking with Paul Barrett. Paul is assistant professor at the School of English and Theatre Studies at the University of Guelph in Ontario, Canada. His research sits at the intersection of Canadian literature, critical race studies, and digital humanities. I'm speaking with Paul about his most recent book, called Remembering Austin Clarke. It's an edited volume of personal reflections, biographical sketches, and scholarly critiques, along with some of Clarke's own selected works, that aims to secure Clarke's position among Canada's most celebrated writers. Clarke was born in Barbados and moved to Toronto in the mid-50s. His novels began appearing in the 60s, and he continued writing well into the 2000s. He won the coveted Giller Prize in 2002 for The Polished Hoe. He was a poet, short story writer, a journalist, and taught at Duke University, the University of Texas, and Yale, establishing Black Studies programs along the way. And yet, despite the awards, prestigious faculty positions, and prolific output, the Canadian literary establishment largely sidelined him because he was Black. In his chapter in the book, Paul describes the situation this way, quote, "Despite his contributions to Canadian writing and his status as a public figure, however, his work is absent from most Canadian literary history and criticism. Indeed, the worst drinking game in CanLit is to flip to the back of a literary history and take a drink for every Clarke, Austin entry in the index. You will be as sober as a late career Leonard Cohen." Unquote. This book, Remembering Austin Clarke, published by Wilfrid Laurier University Press, aims to set the record straight, and maybe even get you drunk. In this final episode of our series, we talk about how the contemporary Canadian literary establishment is changing in ways more beneficial to writers who, years ago, would have been marginalized. Okay, so the title of your book, Remembering Austin Clarke, I assume is inspired by the title he gave his 2015 memoir, simply called Remembering. Just out of curiosity, is that the connection there?
Yeah, that's the connection.
Yeah. Okay.
I'm really bad at titles, so that was the best we could do.
That's good.
Yeah.
So I want to look at or get your thoughts on sort of contemporary Canadian literature and whether or not it's changing in ways beneficial to writers who perhaps years ago were marginalized or ignored, and if so, how?
Yeah, I think contemporary Canadian literature is changing in that way. It's a much more diverse is a kind of diluted word, but it is a more diverse literary landscape where writers from a range of places or writing about a range of topics are now read within the Canadian canon. And I think, the old conceptions of what a Canadian writer looks like, who Canadian writers are, or what they write about, these have really changed in recent years. But the one thing I would say is that this change has come with a little bit of forgetting, where older writers are often neglected. So I think of Austin Clarke, I think of M. Norbesse Phillip, Claire Harris. These are important Black writers working in Canada whose work is often neglected a little bit. And I think if contemporary Canadian literature were to learn one thing, it would be that many of the things that we struggle with today in terms of racism in publishing, sexism in publishing, these kinds of things, these struggles are not new, and that older writers have things to tell us about this stuff.
Yeah, I was going to ask you that too. If it's more than simply just looking at and accepting and including contemporary writers, but also taking a look back as you have and recognizing writers that should have been and pulling them into contemporary lit.
Yeah, and to go even further, I think to challenge the idea that Canadian literature is just encountering questions of race and questions of Blackness or migration or indigeneity or queerness. These questions have been central to Canadian writing, whether they've been repressed or denied or ignored by the establishment. They've been around for a long time, and the new writers are showing us different ways to go and giving that history new life in exciting ways.
Yeah. So Clarke, as we've talked about, was a difficult person socially or even professionally sometimes. But one can certainly see this as reactionary to his environment. An author confident of his own talents that the rest of the literary community doesn't seem to have the fortitude to dig into. In his chapter, David Cheriandy, a writer and protege of Clarke's, alluded to this when he told the story of introducing him to a colleague in a bar who confessed he didn't know who Austin was, to which Austin replied, "And why not?" In a sense, Clarke kind of, demanded or challenged colleagues or other people to know about him. And I'm just kind of curious what you might want to talk about in that with that anecdote that David related.
Yeah, I think that's a great anecdote, and I think I've heard him do that more than once.
Yeah.
I mean, Austin's version of that story, I think I've heard it told. It is a great anecdote. I think for Austin, struggling in a literary landscape like Canada, one had to fight for space
Mm.
and fight for attention. And he learned how to do that in some ways. And, at times he did that by being abrasive or being difficult to work with. But, he was involved in, he was trying to have his work read and recognized in a place that really didn't read or recognize his work. And that requires strategies that aren't always to just be as nice as possible. And so, right. So, Dennis Lee talks about working with Austin Clarke for the short story collection when he was free and young and he used to wear silks. And he says, when they worked on the text as editor and writer, Austin was an absolute pleasure and a workhorse. He worked really hard and edited and submitted many versions of stories. And he said immediately afterwards, he was a complete disaster to work with. He was very difficult and, just didn't treat him very well. And I think that's probably true, but it's also Austin pushing as hard as he possibly can for his work to get attention and to be read, and for resources. So I think that's part of what's going on there.
Yeah, I think in many ways it's, he's doing what he, I mean, there are other circumstances and pressures, but he's doing what writers should be doing in terms of promoting themselves and making themselves known. I mean, he's his own kind of publicist in a way, or
Yeah, absolutely. And hey, he's not the only one. There's lots of writers in Canada who, kick up a fuss when their books aren't
yeah,
reviewed or
right.
get really mad when their books aren't reviewed well.
Hmm.
So, it's not that big a country and we've got lots of writers and not that many readers. So,
Yeah,
you can imagine what that looks like.
yeah. One thing I couldn't help thinking about as preparing for our conversation is and looking at Austin Clarke is that there are so many writers who have just blown through and written about so many different social taboos in their writing, and yet critics and even faculty, for that matter, have managed to remain up to the task and sort of reading that and interpreting it and teaching it. And again, it's maybe I'm going over this too much, but why not Clarke? Especially if his writing is an artistic reflection of Canadian life. I mean, it just seems this argument that it's he's too difficult or there are problematic aspects of his writing. It just doesn't fly.
Yeah, I mean it puzzles me. That's certainly the case. If it were a question of his writing is not good, well, okay, I think that
Yeah.
would make sense. People would just say it's one dimensional and that's that. But I,
Hmm.
I feel pretty confident in saying his writing is good.
Yeah.
It's readable and it's complex and it's interesting. So, it merits attention. He had a standoffish approach to many of the institutions that he would have had to be friendly to in order to have more material success. So that's definitely some of it. I mean, it's obviously racism has
Right.
has an important role to play, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
Canadian literature is in many respects a racist institution who refused to engage with Austin Clarke. So there's that. There's an essay from Patrick Crean, his editor, and he talks about when Clarke won the Giller Prize, and he says when Austin Clarke's name was read out, and they said the Giller Prize goes to Austin Clarke, he said there was an audible intake of breath in the room, which sounds hyperbolic, but I think it's probably true.
Hmm.
Charlotte Gray has a piece in when she was reporting on the Giller Prize, which is basically the toniest and one of the premier award you can win as a novelist in Canada.
Yeah.
And when Charlotte Gray reports on it, she says that Carol Shields, who was terminally ill at the time, was the people's darling. Austin Clarke's name may have been called out, but they chose the wrong writer. Everyone in the room wanted Carol Shields to win, right? So whether this has to do with Clarke's personality, his difficulty, the subject matter, how he treated people, it's hard to know. But yeah, there's certainly, he's been treated like an outsider for many, many years, and it's kind of puzzling as to why.
Yeah. So in the chapter that you wrote, Paul, you reveal there was a moment when this book project was almost abandoned. I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about why and then what kept it going.
Yeah, I don't know if we were going to abandon it, but we definitely had a lot of second thoughts about whether it should go forward.
Mm-hmm.
It was really about Austin's passing and the question of, was this our story to tell? And by our, I'm talking about the people involved at the Puritan at the time. Was this something that we should be doing? I met Austin Clarke, but I wouldn't say he and I were close friends by any means. And he has lots of close friends. Maybe it was up to them to take up the mantle of his legacy and write a bit more about him. And that didn't happen. He died, and there were a few articles about his passing. And a year later, there was no 1 year ago today, Austin Clarke passed away. And, we look forward to the reintroduction or a critical edition of one of his many novels or poems, nothing like that. There was virtual total silence about his writing and so forth. So, after considering it for a little while, I think we just decided that if no one else was going to do this, then we would continue the project. And, we had a lot of people involved who really are and who really were his close friends. And they all said, yeah, you should go ahead with this. This is important. And it's not coming out anywhere else, so you might as well do it.
Right. Okay, excellent. Paul, that's all we have time for. Thank you so much for being on the program.
Thanks very much.
You just heard from Paul Barrett. He is assistant professor at the School of English and Theatre Studies at the University of Guelph in Ontario, Canada. Paul's most recent book is called Remembering Austin Clarke. It's a volume of contributed essays about the Canadian writer, and the book, published by Wilfrid Laurier University Press, also features selected works by Clarke. Wilfrid Laurier University Press is the sponsor of this series. If you like what you hear, rate us or give us a review on your podcast platform of choice, and if there's a topic you'd like us to cover, drop me a line. I'm at bmickey@ala-choice.org. As always, sponsorship and advertising for the Authority File podcast are handled by Choice's advertising manager, Pam Marino, and all of our episodes are produced by Choice's senior digital media producer, Mark Dirks, and digital media assistant, Sabrina Kofer. That's all for this week. Thanks for joining us.